Chair, that's us now live and ready to start.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. We've got a quorum here, and thank you. And if you have any issues with Starleaf, please indicate. I'm offline today. So if you have any issues with the Starleaf, please make it known. Okay. While we're in the meeting, can you mute your microphones until you need to speak? Because all background noise can be picked up. And again, use the WhatsApp facility, the committee WhatsApp facility we have here if you need to raise any questions. The meeting will be recorded and broadcast through Parliament buildings and indeed online. And you can use your mobile devices as long as they're in airplane mode and muted. The first item there is the apologies. Don't have any apologies for today. Chairperson's business. I'd like the opportunity to welcome Tom Buchanan to the committee. Tom is from my own constituency in West Tyrone, and he previously served on the former Agriculture and Rural Development Committee and has a good wealth of experience. And Tom, you're very, very welcome to the committee. And I'd like to take the opportunity as well to publicly thank Maurice Bradley for his commitment and support to the committee work during the course of the time that he was a member. Last week, members, we had a visit to the Peatlands Park just outside Dungannon. And the representatives of the park and the area presented to us on the importance of healthy peatland as a potential carbon sequestration sink, the peatland management and current issues, and the upcoming peatland strategy. And I certainly found this to be a very worthwhile visit, and members found it very informative and relevant to our consideration of the climate change bills. And I have to say that we're very, very thankful for the staff there and to the DERA staff as well. And if members are agreed, can we write to the Peatlands Park staff to thank them for hosting us? Was okay with that? Okay, I want to also remind members that at 2 p.m. today we will have the pleasure of hosting a climate change question and answer session with 3 local schools, the Banbridge Academy, Eulidia Integrated College Carrickfergus, and St Patrick's College in Dungannon. And this will take place via Microsoft Teams. Members will have already received a Derry invite to this event. So I'm grateful if as many members as possible could attend this important question and answer event with our young people. Item 3 in the agenda is the draft minutes. They're from the meeting of the 21st of October at page 6. And can I get agreement for the draft minutes? Yeah. Thank you. And I will sign and date them whenever I get the opportunity about there again on Monday. Okay. Okay, members. We're going to move on now to item number 4, matters arising. I'd like to draw attention to the department's letter at page 17 of your packs, which provides answers to questions raised on the 30th of September. We sought clarity on the compensation paid thus far to contractors who have lost income due to delays in implementing protocol infrastructure, and the total to date is £361,000. Are we content that we respond to the department if they can anticipate any compensation costs will continue to grow, and what financial provisions that they have made for this? We have also asked about the resourcing of the Green Growth Fund and have been advised that there's 1.2 million resource budget allocated for this financial year. Are members okay that we seek clarity on the breakdown allocations to the different green growth work stream patterns? Okay. Okay, members. Okay, members. We're going to move on here to item number 5 on the agenda. That's SL1, Direct Payment to Farmers Simplifications Regulations 2022. Page 21 of your packs, a briefing paper outlining the department's intention to lay regulations before the 1st of January to simplify direct payments. We have previously considered a written briefing on this. By way of reminder, there are 3 amendments as follows. The 3 are as follows. The number of applications for the Young Farmers Payment and the regional reserve will be limited to 3 per person. to prevent entitlements from the regional reserve from being transferred out, which will avoid unfair profiting, and to set a 5-year limit on the length of time that a single farm business can receive the young farmers' payment. Members okay we write to the department with our approval to proceed to the next legislative stage? Can I also ask Nick just for a wee bit more of an elaboration on that the second matter there, the regional reserve one? Nick, will we okay if we took note of that there? Just get a wee bit more of an elaboration on that particular proposed simplification.
Chair, yes, certainly. We can seek further clarity from the department on that point before they would lay the regulation if the committee's content to approve the SL1. Okay.
Members okay? Okay, members, item number 6 on the agenda is an SL1, the direct payment to farmers, review decision regulations NI 2022 and results of consultation. Page 88 of your packs is a summary of the department's consultation on the process of making determinations in appeals on area-based direct payments. The department intends to lay regulations that will compel the department to accept the decision of the independent panel unless an error of law has been made. There will be no department representative on the panel, and a pool of panel members with relevant experience will be recruited by February next year. Are members okay that we write to the department with their approval to proceed to the next legislative stage? Okay, thank you. Okay, members, item number 7 is update on the Science Transformation Programme, a written briefing, page 126 of your packs, an update from the department on the Science Transformation Programme. Following a gateway review in October last year, 2020, it was suggested that a more explicit purpose and outcomes be developed, and these are set out in the briefing paper. Annually, the department spends approximately 1/4 of its budget on scientific research. The research helps inform the department's responses to key strategic challenges such as the transition from the EU, climate change and sustainable economic growth. And the Minister welcomes any views the committee may have. And if you have any particular views in this here, you can raise them now, or if you want to consider them, you can maybe forward them to Nick at the clerk of the committee at the earliest possible opportunity. Okay. Thank you. Okay, members. Item number 8 on the agenda is written briefing. It's a review of Marine Licensing Exempted Activities Order NI 2021 consultation response. Members, at page 133 of your packs is a written briefing on the outcome of the department's consultation on proposed amendments to the Marine Licensing Exempted Activities Order that closed on the 30th of July. The department received 29 responses that were generally supportive of the proposed amendments that will extend the scope of activities for which a marine licence is not required. For example, placement and removal of scientific instruments, removal of litter or lost or abandoned fishing gear, removal of debris and litter by harbour authorities, and placement of or removal of marine markers by DAERA. Are members okay that we note the briefing? Or if you have any questions or comments, you can raise them now or forward them on to the clerk. Okay. Okay, members, just keep an eye on the WhatsApp facility here. Okay. Okay, members, we're on to another written briefing. It's a pre-consultation on the draft environmental strategy. It's at page 172 of your packs, the letter from the department outlining its intention to launch a consultation on the 8th of November, subject to executive approval, on a draft environment strategy for here. A copy of the consultation document will be sent to members in advance of the consultation. Okay. Okay, members. Moving swiftly on to item number 10, it's a written briefing. From the committee clerk, climate change bills, harnessing biogenic methane in the gas network. There's a briefing paper from the clerk at page 176 of your packs. Paper relates to climate change considerations and the ability to harness biogenic methane within the existing gas network. Nick, would you like to take us through this paper?
Chair, thank you very much indeed. Yes. So, members, this was a follow-up to the Minister's attendance at the committee on the 14th of October, where we received a briefing on the green growth strategy, and during that briefing, the Minister mentioned about an initiative that has been undertaken with industry and the department about the prospect of using biogenic methane, or the potential prospect of using biogenic methane within the local gas network. And following that meeting, decided to follow up with two of the providers, the private providers of the gas network locally, to ascertain at what stage that project is. So the summary of the findings are in the briefing paper, and on page, essentially the proposed concept is that excess biogenic methane, which can come from a range of sources, for example, farm holdings, can be used to provide a form of green gas energy, and some countries in Europe have already developed this to a fairly extensive extent. So, for example, approximately 20% of Denmark's gas supply emanates from excess biogenic methane emissions. So the proposition is that methane arising from cattle or pig slurry, poultry waste and grass can actually be injected into the existing gas infrastructure network via anaerobic digesters. So discussion with the two gas suppliers has identified that this biogenic methane provides a viable like-for-like alternative to natural gas, and can be harnessed and deployed within the existing gas pipe infrastructure. There's obviously locally a number of key enablers that would present this as a realistic opportunity to potentially deliver a significant contribution of the local gas supply from biogenic methane. Obviously, we've heard in recent months that, of course, a very large proportion of the local emissions profile comes from biogenic methane. There is also a comparatively relatively low gas demand locally, and the bulk of the demand comes from households. There are approximately 110 anaerobic digesters currently operating in Northern Ireland, and much of the existing gas pipeline network is in close proximity to farmlands that have anaerobic digesters in place already. So this prospect obviously holds a number of potential environmental, economic and policy benefits. So it obviously offers a potential option to offset or recycle methane emissions from the agri-sector. I've been advised by both suppliers that there is no requirement for extensive upgrade of the existing gas infrastructure, and therefore it presents, from a capital perspective, a less costly option than, for example, the development and research and development required to look at hydrogen as a green gas alternative or green energy alternative. I'm advised that there would be no change or difference experienced by household consumers of gas if methane was to be injected into the network, and it obviously provides, I suppose, in the context that we've seen in recent weeks, a potential option for a more secure and stable gas supply. So, with regards to the current position and work that has been taken forward to date, there are 3 private gas companies are actively working on this area, and I've had discussions with the Department for Economy and DERA about development. And as I said, there are 3 current active work streams underway. So I've been advised that there's a joint research initiative undertaken between industry, Queen's and AFBI to scope the projected scale of the potential here, and I'm advised that that's to be published imminently. I'm also advised that the utility regulator has given approval that from Q2 or Q3 of next year, owners of anaerobic digesters will be able to apply for a licence to inject gas from biomethane into the network. And there is also tentative work being undertaken to scope the most appropriate subsidy or payment model to encourage farm holdings to take up this initiative and contribute their methane into the gas network. So the two primary barriers anticipated by the industry are, as I've said, facilitating the most effective payment scheme for owners of anaerobic digesters to inject into the network with appropriate regulatory safeguards, and how this can be sustainably incentivised. And second of all, that there's provision of sufficient capital grant schemes available both for existing owners of digesters to expand their capabilities, and also to encourage, I suppose, implementation of new digesters across the province. So, thought, given our conversations and discussions in recent months and the very sharp focus of the importance of biogenic methane, and after we had heard about this potential initiative, it was important to bring this information to the committee and to seek whether members would be willing to consider writing to the Department for the Economy and DAERA regarding their plans to work on this initiative and whether they envisage any cross-departmental working on this. Thank you, Chair.
Claire, Claire, I know that you want to come in on this issue, and you may maybe having technical difficulties. Are you able to come in, Claire, there? Claire, yes, we're hearing you now. We got you, yes.
Great. Listen, just on this one, I just wanted to raise a few of my concerns on this one, I suppose, because we know that the policy on AD in the past has led to, well, it is what has led to ammonia and nitrogen levels across Northern Ireland to be at crisis point. You know, and I do have concerns. We know that there's 98% of our special areas of conservation that exceed critical loads of nitrogen. And I absolutely understand that AD can deal with some of the issues of emissions from animal waste, but it doesn't deal with the fundamental issue of excess nutrients. And I have a few issues about the committee maybe writing and supporting, if that's what we're being asked, the development of these without sort of looking at the issue as a whole. And it was back in December last year, the Assembly voted to call for the Minister for Infrastructure to review the whole planning system around this. You know, and I have concerns that if we're not looking properly, that what we're doing is going to be endorsing further development without getting the system right. Does that make, do you know what I'm trying to say here? I mean, there's residents up in Limavady, for example, and they have an AD plant there, and it's for energy generation, but that plant runs 24/7, you know, and it's right on their doorstep, and lorries are bringing waste from all over, and I think that plant is owned by a venture capitalist firm based in London, and they get very hefty public subsidies for the energy generated from that as well. So I'd be more keen that as a committee that we maybe seek a research paper from RAISE on green and blue hydrogen, so as we can sort of start to understand the difference between the different forms, and maybe write to the Minister for Infrastructure and seek an update on the Assembly's motion back in November, because that did call for her to conduct a review in the planning application process, and that was to ensure planners have all the appropriate guidance on ammonia and are led by the science and the data to mitigate against the emissions. And maybe even write to the Minister and ask him, to seek an update on his ammonia strategy. We keep hearing about it, but we haven't seen it. And we know that the Green Growth Strategy, for example, was launched. Well, certainly I heard about it during recess on a Tuesday night at 7:30. There was a press release put out with a link to the strategy, so we keep hearing about an ammonia strategy, but we haven't seen it yet either. So there's a lot of other issues connected to this whole issue, and I think there's other things we could be doing as a committee first.
Thank you, Claire. I'll bring in Rosemary here as well, and then we'll come back, Nick, to yourself there. Rosemary?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a couple of comments. those 110 AADs that you speak about, anaerobic digesters, whereabouts are they situated within Northern Ireland? And I have a reason for asking that, because you're talking about injecting into the gas infrastructure. In the West in particular, the gas infrastructure, while we have had gas to the West very recently introduced into the West, the gas infrastructure in the West is still very new, but it's also very limited. And I'm wondering how those digesters will inject into the gas infrastructure, particularly in the West, when it's very, very limited.
Thank you. Thank you.
In relation to that, yeah. And, what talks have been gone on? I'd like to know more about what discussions have gone with the private gas companies in relation to this anaerobic digesters they're injecting into them. I'd just like to know a little bit more about what's happened there.
Nick, do you want to pick up on if there's anything that you can touch on from what Claire and Rosemary has raised? Either you want to take note, go to the department, or if there's something that you can pick up on yourself from your own conversations.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So, Rosemary, yes, in terms of the industry has part of their work is they've obviously scoped extensively the current provision of the gas network in the different counties, and my understanding is that the majority of the operating anaerobic digesters are close to the main pipelines, the majority of which are in the east and mid Ulster. There is, I think it is acknowledged that in the west there is a less extensive infrastructure for the gas network, but that there is the potential for, in the future, if additional anaerobic digesters were to be approved, that they could be connected to the network. I have been provided with, by one of the companies, some information with maps of where the existing gas infrastructure is across Northern Ireland, and that's correlated against the anaerobic digesters. And certainly the point about speaking to or writing to the departments to seek clarity on what conversations have taken place, that's certainly something we can do. And perhaps, to pick up on Claire's point, write separately to the Minister for ERA to scope the development of the ammonia strategy.
And Nick, is it possible for you to provide us with those maps as well? Is that possible?
Yes, certainly. I can. I have those and can circulate them following the meeting today.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to move over to Philip. Philip?
Chair, sorry, I was going to propose something similar to what Claire has proposed, so that issue has been dealt with in terms of the research and the further questions and stuff. So I'm happy enough.
Thank you, Philip. And Tom, your first contribution in your new position on the ERA Committee, Thomas.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your welcome to the committee. Just one issue. I believe this to be a welcome initiative because we have 110 AEDs, and if we can use them and another way to utilise farm waste, if you like, and get it into make it viable for the gas network and so forth, well, I believe that is a welcome initiative. One of the things I did notice here was with regards to the capital grant scheme, and there was just a question was going through my mind with regards to, what are we talking about in regards to capital grant schemes and that type of financial, I suppose, that's going to be required for the owners of these digesters to for this redevelopment or new development of their plants. And has any work been done on that, or do we have any idea as to what that capital scheme would be?
Thank you, Thomas. Nick, have you any assessment from your conversations, or is that something you want to just follow up with the departments?
Chair, thank you. Yes, I suppose that was what I thought, is if we were writing to the departments to specifically ask what extent of planning has been undertaken to date and scoping the potential long-term financial support that may be put in place to support this.
Okay. Good. Patsy? Patsy?
I think I'm only just on there now. Thanks, Chair. I'm similarly of mind to see this map, to see where the AD plants are, and in regard to the connectivity with where the gas network is, because the last thing you want is lorries coming hundreds of miles, literally, by a return journey. I presume what they would be using is some sort of a tanker for to transpose the material, the gas, over to a connection point in the gas network. I think that would be an incredible waste in terms of what you would do and putting up into the atmosphere with all that. So what we'd want to see is, first of all, the strategic linking between where the AD plants are and the gas network, or if we like, the connection points, because just because you have a gas pipe going close by doesn't necessarily mean to say that's the point at which the tanker would connect into the gas system. I'm sure, now I don't know anything at all about the science, but I'm sure there has to be some sort of filtration and quality standard assurance before you could just offload everything coming from an AD plant into, now whether that's done at the AD plant or elsewhere, I just don't know. But a strategic approach which makes sure that we're not encouraging a whole pile of lorries on the road, which would just, well, it would just completely negate any advantage that there would be to the methane being used for the gas network as well. So I think we would need to hear more about how, in fact, that proposal would operate before we just go bogging in and talking about grants and capital works and everything. I would like to hear maybe a research paper might be able to help us in some way, but if someone out there has experience of how this operates in other countries and other jurisdictions, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think it definitely merits more of an investigation. Nick, what do you believe? What's your opinion on this?
Oh, no, Chair, absolutely, yes, indeed. Patsy, as I said, we'll circulate those maps, and perhaps as part of the correspondence, just scoping what work has been done to ask that question about the connectivity of what would be entailed in the connectivity, because I don't think the suggestion is that the gas would be transported via lorries, that there would be a direct connection between the digesters and the existing infrastructure of the pipes of the network.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, Claire? Claire?
Thanks, Chair. Listen, I'm just very conscious that the committee are being asked here to write to two departments regarding our views and on supporting these developments. Can I ask who the two private companies are?
Yeah, Nick. Sorry, Nick.
Chair, yes, indeed. They're the two out of the three that I spoke to were representatives from Phoenix Gas and Firmus Energy, and I believe the third partner is SNG.
Okay, Claire?
No, there's is there any way, I mean, this is a big issue, and I know that there are sort of what's called good and bad forms, and this is probably one of the better ones, but there's a big problem in our system about how we deal with these, and it lies with planning, and it lies with internal policy, and the Environment Agency, we even know that their planning policy their operational protocols for AD plants is unlawful. Officials have stated this publicly as well. Can the committee, I don't see how we can support these proposals to continue expanding development within a faulty system. Is there any way that we as a committee can call for even an independent review on that?
Well, I suppose we would make a representation to the infrastructure minister on this, on the planning aspect. Claire, that'd be fair.
Okay, thank you.
Nick, do you want to pick up on any of that there, the planning aspect of it?
Chair, I suppose just to go back perhaps on Claire's earlier point about writing to the Minister for Infrastructure as an update on the motion that was passed last year, we could seek clarity on what, if any, plans the Department for Infrastructure has with regards the planning process for ADs.
Yeah. Is it okay, Claire?
Is there any way we could contact the Dairy Minister or the Environment Agency as well, and just ask for an update? Well, one on the ammonia strategy, but also on their internal policies. You know, and this was an issue that, you know, the Minister wrote directly to, I think it was the Chief Executive of Middle East Antrim Council, you know, when there was a backup in the system. So we had Shared Environmental Services reviewing their internal policy and changing that. And I think the UFU came forward and tried to launch a judicial review. And the Minister stepped in and wrote for clarity in terms of, you know, NIEA's internal policy there as well. So there's a whole thing to be looked at. And you know, our planning system looks at individual emissions from individual planning applications without the cumulative impact on an area as a whole. And if we're not looking at that cumulative impact, then that's where we've been going wrong. And that's why we're breaching EU directives and legal obligations that we do have, and leading to huge levels of nitrogen pollution as well as ammonia across Northern Ireland. So there's a whole issue to be looked at there.
Okay. And can we factor all of that in our representation to DFA, Nick?
Chair, yes,
and
certainly.
Chair as well.
Chair, yes, certainly. We'll correspond with both departments and note all of those points, including an update on the internal policies within DAERA with regards looking at the planning applications for the ADs and how they have been addressing potential environmental concerns in that regard.
Thank you.
Pat, are you looking in there? No, I thought I heard Patsy looking in. Okay, we've got a few action points there, Philip. Or, sorry, Nick.
Chair,
okay.
Yes, we've got those noted. Thank you.
Thank you now. Okay, members, we're going to move on then now to the item number 11. It's from Nick again, as topics for a mini inquiry. There's a briefing paper at page 180 of the packs. You'll recall from our strategic plan discussions in September, the committee considered embarking on a mini investigation before the end of the mandate. And Nick has given us a paper on potential lines of inquiry. Nick, do you want to take us through the paper there, please?
Chair, thank you. Yes, let's just members will recall back in September time we discussed the potential before the end of the mandate of doing a mini or targeted investigation in an area of policy, and we did discuss the prospect of looking at the rollout of Project Stratum, which is the initiative to roll out broadband to rural areas. However, after further discussion, I understand that the Committee for the Economy has, in recent weeks and months, focused quite a lot of attention and scrutiny on this project in particular, and has been actively scrutinising the work of the Department for the Economy and the rollout. And I suppose in that context, it was perhaps inadvisable for us as a committee to proceed and look at that, given that it's already been given a significant amount of attention from another committee. After a bit of thinking about other areas that the committee may potentially wish to look at, we put forward a number of potential options the committee may wish to consider if it would like to proceed to do a short targeted investigation. So one of the potential suggestions is at page 181 is some sort of evaluation of the impact of the Rural Needs Act that came into effect in 2016. So five years ago, and potentially looking at an assessment of its effectiveness, and particularly how departments, arm's length bodies and public bodies, their experience of having to undertake rural needs assessments, what their experience of that has been, and has that actively changed their policy approach or decision making. And potentially we could also include some sort of public engagement or survey in that topic for individuals living in rural areas to see if what their experience has been in the last 5 years, and whether they have what the level of awareness is of the Rural Needs Act, and has it made a difference on the ground. So that's a potential suggestion. Option 2 then is a potential look at doing a public survey to identify and highlight the social, economic and health impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic in rural areas. So we could facilitate that through a public survey to gauge individuals' thoughts, views and opinions as to how they've been affected by the pandemic, what the particular challenges have been in rural areas, and the key issues needed in the recovery. We could also augment that with a stakeholder evidence session with the department and rural community groups. A couple of other options are outlined on page 182. Option 3, following our discussion at the committee meeting a couple of weeks ago, we potentially could look at a bit more focused work about the role of women in undertaking farm management or control of farms locally, to look at an analysis of the barriers preventing women from taking on farm management roles. I'm aware that DAERA has recently engaged in conversations with some local stakeholders about looking at this issue on a wider agricultural basis, so it may be something that may be of interest. We could look at undertaking a survey with women living on or near farm holdings to scope their views on the viability of farming as a career, what the challenges are and how they could be improved. We could also look at collating data in the various jurisdictions about the breakdown of the workforce on farms, and to engage with the department, CAFRE and other stakeholders to scope the policies that they have in place in this area. And then a last potential suggestion is we could potentially look at the current opinions in rural communities with regards to Brexit and the protocol. Obviously, the main purpose would be to ascertain if these have changed since the time of the referendum, and if they've been impacted following the end of the transition period and the establishment of prospective trade deals by the UK government with other countries. That might give the committee an opportunity to capture the key concerns, issues and opportunities that rural communities see with the position as it stands. So I suppose those were a number of potential areas of suggestion, and if the committee is so minded to continue to undertake a short targeted inquiry, the committee team would be happy to facilitate that, or indeed if there are any other topics or areas of suggestion. Thank you, Chair.
Patsy?
Touched on there yet?
Yeah, have you, Patsy?
Okay. Chair, just looking at, I'm sure like yourself and others who represent the rural areas, the impact of COVID on the rural areas, much of it is yet unseen, because there's a lot of mental health problems have arisen, and because of access to services and all those sorts of things, they're a big problem now. That's just not exclusive to rural areas, but the whole issues of support services by way of, say for example, home help services, domiciliary care work, that is just almost crashed. It's awful, especially in the rural areas, some of the more isolated rural areas. It has in fact become town versus rural, and the more isolated you're living in rural areas, the more of a problem it becomes. But certainly the economic aspects of people working from home, broadband, all those sorts of things that are impacting now, and that, I think that would prove for a very, very useful exercise for ourselves as a committee, just throwing the net out there to see what issues are coming back.
Yeah, that's right. So you're proposing that we literally throw that to see what how do you think, what do you think we should progress with?
That one there, to option 2, the impact of COVID-19 in rural areas, as Nick was suggesting there, first of all, an online survey and stakeholder evidence sessions. I think that would be it'll be very, very important to us, because I'm sure there are a lot of issues that, as elected representatives, we're coming into contact with, but there may well be other latent issues that we're not as fully au fait with, and the likes of the survey and stakeholder evidence sessions could bring those to the fore, because this is uncharted waters we're in, and we need to be really on top of the issues in our own areas.
But spotlight on the lack of services, basic services in rural areas, but spotlighting that too, wouldn't it, Patsy, maybe? And
that has been exacerbated by the COVID-19. There's no doubt about it, and the change in just the societal change in how people work, how people move around, how people are educated, all those sorts of things, indeed transport issues as well. I think, well, that's my opinion anyway, that option 2 would be a very helpful one at this time. Yeah. I'm not saying that the others aren't important, but it's just with this pandemic and the issues that we're coming through, it's very, very important that we try in some way or other to keep abreast of all the issues.
Yeah. Yeah. What does other members think of that? Or are you broadly okay with the Patsy suggestion? Thomas?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, no, I would agree with Patsy on this particular issue, because I believe within the rural areas especially, and a lot of it which is isolated, there are, I believe there's still a number of issues that even as elected representatives we're not aware of and we're not up to speed with on the impact that the COVID has on these particular areas. I do think this would obviously open up that door, if you like, and hopefully would be something that would be able to provide or help to provide then a greater knowledge to the assembly members, to the elected members, but also maybe even to provide a greater help for those within the rural communities.
Thank you, Thomas.
I certainly agree with Patsy on option 2.
Yeah, Rosemary?
While I can't disagree with the previous 2 speakers, I'm afraid I would go for option 3. I think women have been neglected for so long within agriculture, and I do think we need to move onwards, move forward, and take a look at women in farm management. You know, very often you hear if the farm is left to the son, not to the daughter, and we've got to look forward in relation to agriculture and maybe encourage more women into farming, into farm management, and I think I would opt for option 3.
Thank you. Members, any other views on this? Funny, Rosemary, just what we actually could find out that the COVID pressures may well have put more pressure on women.
Exactly.
I think that's a big factor as well. Claire?
Yeah, just to add anything to that, I agree with what Rosemary's saying there entirely. I think that's the just transition principles, and we need to begin to embed those for any future policy. So I'd agree with that too.
Okay. Well, Nick, we've had 2 suggestions here. Do you want to maybe see, is there some way we can come up with, is there a way we can incorporate both into a mini inquiry?
Chair, yes, indeed. Thank you. No, and thank you, members. That was really helpful, and I appreciate that. Probably all the areas are of interest and important, and I suspected that those 2 would be ones that the committee would want to support. Not seeking a division or a vote today, but I suppose maybe a suggestion, maybe I could flesh out terms of reference and a methodology for both of those, and then maybe we could revisit that in a couple of weeks' time and give members opportunity to have a think about it further, and then we could seek to have a firmer position in a couple of weeks if I will work up, as I say, a bit more definitive work plan for what both of those could look like, or indeed if we could amalgam in some way.
Yeah, because I think we'll find very strong themes of isolation and exclusion running through both sort of topics that have been suggested today.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you to that, members, and thank you, Nick, for agreeing to take on board what has been raised and to come back with terms of reference and suggestions. Okay, members, Item number 12 is we have oral evidence now on the from a number of stakeholders on climate change number 2 bill. We will have a joint presentation by a number of key stakeholders on the number 2 bill. I'd like to draw your attention to a memo from Nick at page 184 of the pack. You'll also find a briefing paper by Nilga on the table papers. And I want to welcome by Starleaf, Ms. Karen Smith from Nilga, Dr. Ciara Brennan and Dr. Thomas Munger from the Environmental Justice Network, Mr. Aidan Campbell from the Rural Community Network, and we have the Belfast Climate Commissioner as well. Is that right? With us as well? Yeah.
Chair, excuse me, apologies. I'm advised that we've just received apologies from the Belfast Climate Commission. They had indicated attendance, but unfortunately they can't be here today. Apologies, Chair.
That's okay, thank you. Okay, members, you're very welcome to the committee this morning. We very much welcome your engagement and support on this matter. It helps us to scrutinise the bill. Basically, this is the way we will work with it. I'll ask one representative from each organisation to give a brief summary of the organisation's views on climate change bill number 2 for about, say, 3 or 4 minutes. And if you're okay, we'll begin with Karen, and then we'll hear from Ciara and Thomas, and then Aidan. Would that be okay? So, and then after we'll get some questions and answers from the after your statements. The members will ask some questions. Okay, so members, Karen, you okay to kick off this?
Yes, can you hear me, Chair?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. And thanks very much for the opportunity to speak this morning. I'm obviously conscious that our President, Councillor Robert Burgess, is here. He was hoping to just announce or to introduce my comments, but I'll kick off. And Chair, you'll have read our submission, so I'll try to keep comments to a minimum. I'd like to assure the committee that the local government is keen to see effective actions to mitigate and adapt to climate change put in place as soon as possible to prevent further irreversible damage to our planet. To enable this to happen, we need strong local climate legislation and a robust climate action plan. To develop public understanding of the issue, to allocate government resources for action, to encourage private sector confidence and attract investment, to direct the development of new skills and to ensure a just transition. As we've previously told the committee, the majority view within NILGA is supportive of the DAERA intent to set an at least 82% net reduction in Northern Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, with other members favouring the more stringent approach taken by the private members' bill. We are also supportive of the interim targets laid out in the departmental bill. But NILGA has some concern that there's room within this bill to lengthen the time available to achieve these targets or to reduce the targets. This must be prevented with any allowable change geared towards tightening rather than relaxing these targets. And we therefore recommend amending clauses 4 and 5. NILGA supports the policy objectives of the bill and the explicit inclusion with the bill of the adaptation programme and reporting. However, we have concerns that the bill is very much orientated towards government, with the obvious intent to include sectoral targets in associated strategies and climate action plans. We believe that the explicit mention of key sectors in the private members' bill rendered that bill more accessible and easily understood by the public, with more clarity on where the greatest action was required. We had hoped that sectoral targets might surface within the draft Green Growth Strategy, but the consultation document on that strategy notes that, and I quote, "We do not set sectoral targets in this strategy. This will be informed by a Northern Ireland Specific Climate Change Act, which will provide additional detail around specific targets." NILGA is not particularly confident that the departmental bill actually does inform sectoral targets, instead passing responsibility on to departments to take this work forward. And this bill is much more arm's length than we would like. And this concern extends to reporting requirements. Part 3 of the bill is focused on the government departments and seems to deflect responsibility and reporting away from emitting sectors. We're also aware of the degree of crossover of government responsibilities between departments, and we'd be keen to see some sort of responsibility map and sectoral reporting plan for transparency purposes. Part 4 of the bill places duties on the UK Climate Change Committee to send reports to the department at relevant times, giving a view on the department's progress against emissions targets and carbon budgets. NILGA has concerns that there's no mechanism for dealing with failure. We also object to the wording of clause 21 of the bill, which talks about imposing a duty on councils. Councils are already active in developing local climate action plans and adaptation plans in the absence of resources, legislation or a requirement to report, a fact which is lauded in the draft Green Growth Strategy. Imposition of such a duty therefore seems somewhat heavy-handed. As a sector, we would prefer to co-design future requirements and to be treated as a partner in government rather than as a wayward child. We will seek clarity from the Department on what they require from councils as a key partner and look forward to appropriate resources being made available both to councils to enable effective delivery and to the Department to enable effective central-local partnership working. NILGA is deeply aware, however, that the main cost of this legislation will not be to the departments responsible for developing policy and strategy, but to the affected sectors and the community who will be reliant on government and other investors to ensure a just and fair transition. The opportunities and costs of this change are only beginning to surface, and it's imperative that we develop a better evidence base to ensure that the most vulnerable are protected and that no one gets left behind. A multi-year funding approach will be vital. We're confident, however, that the long-term opportunities and benefits will outweigh the short-term costs. We look forward to the opportunities that new technology will bring for energy, transport and agriculture, and we would advocate a Green New Deal approach. We look forward to working more closely with the UK Climate Change Committee and with colleagues nationally, across the border and internationally as we face our common challenge. Thank you, Chair. We're happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karen. I'll move to our speakers, then we'll come in for questions and after the opening speeches. Thank you for that. Okay then, what was the order then? Ciara?
Hi there.
Hi, Ciara. Hi, Ciara. How are you?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. My name is Dr. Ciara Brennan. I'm a lecturer at Newcastle University and I'm the Director of the Environmental Justice Network Ireland. On behalf of EJNI, I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to present evidence on Climate Change Bill number 2 today. I think at the outset I'd sort of like to highlight that COP26 has seen the global community commit to ramping up action to address the climate crisis. It's been all over the news the last couple of weeks. The enhanced ambition, I think, being demonstrated by world leaders in all the news that's coming out from this summit, I think really throws into sharp resolution the shortcomings of the bill that's before the committee today. In brief, the bill is outdated, outmoded and unfit for purpose. Our status as a climate laggard will be cemented in perpetuity if we do not introduce legislation that is far more sophisticated and more ambitious than the bill that's before the committee today. I think while the framework bill does include many helpful features, its components just don't go far enough in crucial areas, and there are also important components that are just missing completely. Firstly, robust accountability mechanisms are absent. I think this is really important in the Northern Irish context where enhanced accountability is essential because public trust has been eroded by decades of weak governance and regulation in the context of the environment. I think as well we also have an inherent conflict of interest because we have a single minister and a department responsible for both agriculture and the environment. And I think this fundamental conflict of interest requires a higher level of accountability that's just not currently present in Bill number 2. Secondly, just transition principles are missing from the bill. I think enshrining these principles in primary legislation will provide unequivocal protection to those most gravely impacted by climate change. But I think it's also important that we recognise that a just transition principles will provide protection to those impacted by the necessary process of moving to a low carbon economy. So, for example, the agricultural community. In my opinion, this essential component should not be relegated to strategy or secondary legislation. Finally, the absence of transboundary considerations, given the shared nature of environmental challenges on this island, is a serious omission. The current governance arrangements for all island cooperation on the environment are not functioning in a way which ensures shared action can withstand turbulent politics. Enshrining the need for consideration of transboundary issues in primary legislation would in effect insulate action on climate from political developments. In addition, inclusion of a prerogative to consider developments and advice from beyond the UK would contextualise Northern Ireland's role within the global community's action on climate. Conversely, setting unambitious targets which diverge from those in place south of the border within the UK and those created within the EU and global community, as we've seen this week through the COP26 summit, will leave Northern Ireland behind. This carries with it a far greater risk than taking meaningful action on climate now. the cost of inaction will be far, far higher than investing in making the necessary changes to how we live now. And I think the people who live here deserve better than that. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Munzer, who's going to talk about some of the areas of the bill before the committee where it just simply does not go far enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could I just confirm with the chair, please, that you can hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Nice to be back with you all today. Thomas Munzer, University of Aberdeen and EJNI. So let's move on now to consider the distinct category of areas where the bill doesn't appear to go far enough. And I think here we can usefully begin with what appear to be some outdated and unambitious targets. So the 2030, 2040 and 2050 emissions targets are useful components of the Act because they do set out a clear trajectory over time that gives policymakers a temporal indication of where the jurisdiction needs to be at minimum at the turn of each decade. But those features are partially undermined, however, by the negative trend that's been partially distinguished already in certain things Dr. Brennan pointed to, namely they don't go far enough. And this is evident where one considers the levels that the targets are actually set at. The levels don't work towards a net zero emissions reduction target, neither prior to 2050 nor by the time of 2050. And that's a departure from prevailing global scientific and political opinion about how quickly jurisdictions must act to avoid catastrophic climate change. So the weaker level of ambition renders each of the targets and the general reductions trajectory that they sketch out as generally unsuitable in our view, and especially given the widely accepted premise that the cost of inaction or delayed action will far surpass that of mitigation and of making a swift and a just transition to a low carbon economy now. Now, coming on to the issue of a weak carbon budget pathway, the carbon budgets proposed under the Act are also useful and largely follow standard practice found in certain other climate change acts. However, the negative trend that we've described again exerts something of an undermining impact on this feature. The weak trajectory for emissions reductions employed by the framework drives a carbon budget pathway that's too weak for suitable purpose and is somewhat outdated compared to prevailing views on how quickly jurisdictions should be acting. And moving on to the notion of inconsistency regarding the role of the UK Committee on Climate Change, or CCC, it's also worth pointing out, I think, that DERA arguably appears to apply partially different and potentially inconsistent interpretations of the degree to which the NI Assembly can dictate the role of the UK CCC in the Climate Change No. 2 bill on the one hand, and in its critique of the Climate Change No. 1 bill on the other hand. Part 4 of Bill No. 2 endeavours to compel the CCC to do a range of things in fairly strident language. So, for example, to quote section or clause 22, subsection 1, quote, before the end of 2027, the Committee on Climate Change must send a report to the Department, and so on and so forth. I emphasise the word must here. Now, it may be possible that the NI Assembly does have the authority to insist that the committee must carry out that sort of action, but it makes for slightly curious reading given that DERA's document entitled DERA Response to ERA Committee Call for Evidence, Views on the Non-Executive Climate Change Bill, makes the following sorts of emphatic points in relation to the Climate Bill No. 1's proposed net zero target for 2045 in relation to the CCC. So to quote from that document, quote, as the CCC advice has been ignored in the setting of the headline target within this bill, which was net zero 2045, there is an issue and difficulty in expecting the CCC to provide advice on progress with action plans to deliver a target which they do not consider to be credible, end quote. So it's difficult, I'd suggest, to see how the DERA bill can use fairly strident language to compel the CCC to undertake certain tasks when DERA has suggested already, albeit incorrectly, I think, in our view, that the CCC appears to enjoy a substantial degree of autonomy that permits it to choose whether or not it will engage with such obligations set down in a Northern Irish climate bill, per the quotation just offered, regardless of the level of ambition of its targets. So moving towards close, and just coming on briefly to responsibilities for key duties, it's also worth pointing out, I would suggest, that these appear to be somewhat unclear in certain places. So if we look at clause 29, it appears to inadequately socialise key duties under the terms of the bill across the Northern Ireland departments in a somewhat nebulous manner. So the duty to secure a primary target, such as the 2050 target, for instance, should ideally be placed, in my view, on an identifiable responsible actor. So, for instance, the minister who holds the primary portfolio, so the Minister for DERA. Maybe another credible option could be the Executive Office. And just lastly, to conclude, it's prudent to acknowledge the bill's apparently somewhat weak overarching message. I think the overall tendency created by the emissions and somewhat weakened components of Bill number 2, we'd suggest, creates something of a negative trend and something of a negative impression, which doesn't go just far enough to signal to society the scale of the changes necessary to ensure a just transition to a low-carbon economy. I'll end there. Thank you for listening.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Munzer. That was very informative. And I'm going to move on over to Aidan Campbell.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just check you're hearing me all right?
Yeah, we got you, Aidan, yeah.
Great. Thanks to the committee for the invitation. I work for Rural Community Network as a policy officer. I'm going to make a few general comments overall in terms of climate change in rural communities, and then a few short comments about the bill. So in terms of climate change debate in rural communities, it's often framed in the negative. What we've got to give up or change as opposed to what we could gain and the opportunities that arise from change. And we think we need to reframe that to bring more people into the debate. Tackling climate change, tackling air and water pollution, restoring biodiversity and ecosystems can't be done without farmers and landowners. They're integral to any actions taken. However, we need to recognise that although the focus of the debate on climate change bill impacts in rural Northern Ireland has been on farming and agri-food to date, there are other important considerations in rural areas, like travel and the need to reduce emissions in rural communities. We recognise it's harder to develop and promote public and active transport in rural areas, but focusing on towns and cities isn't going to be enough to reduce emissions when 35% of our population are rural and are travelling for longer distances. Fuel poverty and heating. We're heavily dependent in rural areas on oil and solid fuel for home heating, and there's going to be significant investment needed in retrofitting, but that also has potential job opportunities in rural areas. Reducing commuting and promoting working from home and local working as far as possible has a potential to revitalise towns and villages and go some way to meet the programme for government outcome of achieving balanced regional development. And measures to restore biodiversity and ecosystems have potential to develop sustainable tourism in rural areas, but that needs to be carefully thought through in terms of access and sustainability. In terms of the of Bill number 2, RCN made a written submission to the call for evidence, and the details are in that. But in terms of some of the headline points from our organisation, we welcome the intention to introduce climate change legislation in Northern Ireland as we're lagging way behind other jurisdictions. We don't think a legally binding target for net reduction in carbon of 82% is achievable by 2050 without a matching commitment by government to fund measures that will support people and businesses and farmers to make a just transition. Meeting the target will need a massive level of political leadership and commitment to deliver this scale of transformation for our society. As well as individual and household change, the achievement of carbon reduction targets across society requires a Marshall Plan style transition in terms of our energy, our land use and food system, rapid development of efficient zero carbon technology, and development of economic models that focus on well-being. In principle, RCN believes in the need to decarbonise. Setting a stretching target shows leadership and ambition, but we require much wider and deeper engagement with individual citizens, with communities and businesses to develop a collective understanding of what moving to a low-carbon or zero-carbon society is going to mean. In our view, an independent office will be required to monitor progress and assess performance of government departments in meeting carbon budgets and interim emissions targets. And if progress isn't being made or is judged to be too slow to meet interim carbon reduction targets, how is that going to be addressed? The bill doesn't appear to make a provision to address that. The final point that our board were concerned with was how will carbon leakage be measured and taken account of in the carbon budgeting process. RCN wouldn't want to see a climate change bill which, for example, reduced meat and dairy production in Northern Ireland to simply replace it with meat and dairy imports from other countries, which require a higher carbon footprint to produce, as we would see that as being completely counterproductive. So that's really our initial statement, Chair. And again, thanks for the opportunity to come along to the committee.
Perfect. And Councillor Burgess, sorry for not referencing you at the outset. Is there anything you'd like to add, Councillor Burgess? You're very welcome.
Thank you, Chair members. It's good to see you again to further discuss the climate legislation that's being taken forward in Northern Ireland. And obviously, we met with you in September in relation to the private members bill. Yeah. And I welcome the opportunity to explore with the departmental bill with more detail with you. And I will also be at COP26 next week to promote the importance of local government and tackling the climate crisis. And I hope it won't be too long before we have a credible local climate legislation in place here in Northern Ireland. And Chair, I'll not hold up the meeting, but thanks very much for inviting Nilga along today to give you some interviews. Thank you, Chair.
And we greatly value the input from Nilga and their views on both of these, the scrutiny of both these bills. Patsy?
All right. Are you okay? I'm okay. Can you hear me okay, Chair? Yes?
Patsy, yeah.
Thanks very much, everybody, for presenting your evidence there today. And now, there's a number of things just I would like to expand on a wee bit further. While it's an issue, just the role, as mentioned earlier there, of the Climate Change Committee, I'm just trying to figure out or factor out what role people feel they should have in overseeing progress or otherwise here in the North whenever we get to the stage of a climate change bill. And that's just one issue, and that's pretty simple one way or another. But I need to get it clarified in my own mind just what that is. But the major issues that were coming through, and this is one of the things I would like to put to you all, because it's not very clear from the bill what that might be. Now, and Aidan was touching upon that in his presentation there about transport issues, about homes being refurbed, and about working from home. And we were talking about some of that earlier, if you were listening, on the post-COVID, the potential for a mini inquiry by the Committee on Post-COVID Problems or Issues in the Community in the rural areas. But can I put it to you, a key to all this will be, in terms of buy-in from rural communities in particular, will be what that just transition in practice means. What it holds opportunities, or sorry, I'll word that slightly differently. It may hold opportunities, but in order for it to hold those potential opportunities, we need a bit more meat on the bones, which seems to not be included in this climate change bill too. So could I maybe just from each of you hear what you see as that just transition actually meaning? It sounds a good concept, but in practice, what are the outworkings of that as you would see that, so that we can arrive at the point where there's maximum buy-in to any climate change legislation on the way forward?
Okay. Does anyone want to pick up on that, kick off on that?
Chair, maybe if I come in, I mean, certainly one of the concerns we have with this bill is just it's really just reads like government talking to government, and it's pushing. And I think Thomas mentioned earlier on, it's like pushing the clarity on what's required further down in the strategy and policy, and that makes it sort of on the long finger. It's not just as accessible to people as to what's required. I think there's fear out there in what's coming, and a lack of understanding in what's coming. And I mean, certainly we'd be very much in favour of widespread carbon literacy training to make sure that people understand what's required of them, and what is how their life is going to change. We would be keen to see the different departments, the sort of Department for Economy and DAERA working together, particularly on the energy piece. And that's particularly important in rural areas where they're not on the main gas network, and even if the gas network changes to hydrogen, for example, that won't necessarily impact on a lot of rural housing. So there's an awful lot needs to happen, but there's not the clarity in this bill to really set the course for making those changes. So that's particularly difficult. In relation to the Climate Change Committee, I mean, they have obviously outlined a number of actions that they want to see taken forward urgently by Northern Ireland government in the next 2 years. So they're sort of keen to get things going. But it's that sort of role for them is a wee bit unclear, and I'm not sure whether there have been even discussions between the department and the Climate Change Committee about this role for them and about this. They must do things, and the department's ability to require them to maybe to inform the process. So there is that. It's just a bit. There's not an awful lot of clarity on any of that stuff.
Is any other first takers want to pick up on anything that Patsy's raised there?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in if everybody can hear me okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that the Paris Agreement obviously, realizes that we have to take action to reduce greenhouse gases, but we have to take into account the imperatives of the just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs. I think that that's highlighted as well in the recent IPCC report, where it's sort of the code red for humanity, the consideration of ethics and equity can actually help deal with the uneven distribution of the impacts of the climate crisis. So we know that the just transition has to happen one way or another when we're dealing with the impacts of the climate crisis and attempts at mitigation and adaptation. However, I think that really needs to be considered very carefully, as Patsy has said, about what does that mean in practice. Mm-hmm. I think this bill, it doesn't really mention it. We've got some just transition principles and some of the strategies that are coming out from it, but without hooking it into primary legislation, that does kind of undermine the principles. I think ultimately what just transition means is that the climate, that people can't be left stranded whenever we make these transitions that are going to happen. The climate legislation introduced in Northern Ireland, it must recognise that reality. It has to support jobs and the growth of jobs that are both climate resilient, but also environmentally and socially sustainable. It has to support net zero carbon investment. It has to create work that is very high value, that's fair, sustainable, and that reduces inequality as far as possible. Neighbouring jurisdictions already have those mechanisms, and I think, what we need to see this as that is a protection for communities such as the agricultural community, rather than climate. Rather than, if that's not included in climate legislation, that protection is missing. So this bill does not go far enough to protect the agricultural community and those who are going to be impacted by the transition, as well as those impacted by climate change. So I think, rather than integrating into legislation, weak or unambitious targets, by producing legislation that includes a just transition and that's really robust and really sophisticated and helps address that head on, that would be a far, far better approach than pushing the problem down the line without, and essentially leaving people stranded. That would be my take on it.
Just picking up on that, Ciara, please, and I don't want to land you in the middle of it, but obviously you're a specialist in your own field. Now, and if you were meeting, I'm sitting in Cookstown here, meeting a man or woman down the street here who's from a rural background, some of the rural isolated areas, and they say, "Hey, what are you boys doing up at Stormont here, all this climate change stuff?" And if I say to him or her, "Oh, we're working on just transition," they'll look at me as if I've grown wings or something, So if you could give me practical examples of what, in effect, just transition would mean, so that we can start to put meat on the bones of this. It's a good concept, it seems to be a good concept, but so that, to get back to my original point, so that there's maximum buy-in by your average member of society saying, that's a good thing, I'm committed to climate change mitigations and trying to address this huge issue that's affecting us, but what does it mean in that transition to that new, hopefully better society?
Well, I think that, obviously the climate action plans are going to put in, the detail of how we meet targets ultimately. And I think, how the reductions that have to happen are shared out amongst the different sectors, that's going to be decided, through lots of consultation. And that will essentially provide, will identify the areas that need support. And in doing that, we'll then identify, what kind of support is necessary. So for example, if farmers and the agriculture community are being asked to reduce their emissions, how can we help them do that in a way that not only addresses the reduction, but that's required, but also ensures a sustainable agricultural economy, that sustainable jobs, that creates rural communities that are connected, that are have a high quality of life, and that aren't being impacted unfairly. So there are all sorts of potential subsidies that you could use, and I know that's being used in other jurisdictions that are heavily reliant on agricultural the agricultural economy. So a system where farmers are supported in making that transition, and that they're protected through primary legislation, so that in a couple of years' time, whenever the truth comes crashing down of the extent to which we have to make these changes, we're not sitting going, oh Jesus, we should have done that 2 years ago. We're ahead of the game, and the farmers, there's been protection put in place for all of the sectors, and including not just for agriculture, but for domestic heat poverty, issues like that, that we have set that up in strong legislation now to ensure those people aren't stranded in a position where the industry comes crashing down. That's actually protected from the start. My colleague Dr. Munzer, may have some additional comments to make in that respect.
Yeah, just very briefly. Thanks, Ciara, and very good questions, Mr. McGlone. I think briefly, the first question, the CCC, what role does it have? They're set out under Part 2 of the Climate Change Act 2008 and the schedules. So it's reporting and advisory functions. I don't see anything particularly at odds in those functions with what's proposed in this bill, but I did underscore the language is a little strident in asserting that the CCC will do certain things. That aside, and it just underscores well, I know that you're all having a discussion around a climate commissioner. I think there's probably capacity created for an NI climate commissioner to augment the functions of the CCC. I don't necessarily see that there would be any degree of conflict per se. But in terms of the just transition, I think you're quite right. There's not much meat in the bone in the legislation. It's partly a function of this type of legislation. We're looking at framework legislation, aren't we? And by the very nature of the framework, often the meat isn't necessarily as on the bones as we'd like. In the area of just transition, I think that provides a particular problem because it will become very abstract if we don't flesh it out. And I think the committee's been directed previously to the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009. If you look at Section 35C, which I believe you've been directed to, it's very, very helpful because in that legislation, the Scots articulate their understanding in legislation of just transition principles, so that makes them concrete. And then one needs to go beyond that and say, well, what does one do with that principle? And what the Scots do is they establish a duty in their legislation for climate action plans, which are to be set out on a rolling basis by the Scottish Government to be construed sort of in concert with those principles. The plans are to reflect the input of those principles, and it's not a sort of negative abstract obligation. The government has to account for how it's factored the principles in. So that's a very good starting point for avoiding some of the difficult abstractions and lack of meat in the bone in this area that you rightly point to.
Okay, thank you for that. And just, I was going to actually maybe it's a wee elaboration of Patsy's. See, one of the issues that we've got a wee briefing on from the clerk is in Scotland. They've got the Just Transition Commission in Scotland, and I note they've got the Agricultural Transformation Programme to enable farmers to make that just transition. Do you think there'd be any role for something similar here in the north to enable, for example, the agriculture sector to make that type of transition, Ciara or Thomas or anyone?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely scope for some body. I mean, it could be contained within other sort of accountability bodies that are proposed by, legislation. But I think that, we should really place the just transition front and centre. That is where the impact of the transition to a low or zero carbon economy, that's where it's going to be felt by society, by people living in the ground. And, Patsy was saying to me, I'm sitting up in Cookstown, if a farmer comes to me and says, what does that mean? That's why it has to be enshrined, and there has to be an accountable structure to ensure that happens. Because if it doesn't happen, we just simply won't bring people along with us. And, there's a political imperative to, push forward for strong action on climate. But, politicians have to, be supported by society. And that's why there should be a strong signal that any legislation that we introduce is going to protect society, not just from the worst impacts of climate change, but on the transition itself. And that's what a just transition is about. It's about fairness, and it's about ensuring that, like I said before, that people aren't left stranded, and that, when we do make these moves, that government is ahead of the game. As we've said, we've been a climate laggard. We now have to catch up. We have to do it quickly. There's no time to, sit and wait for the effects to impact society and then act retrospectively. By ensuring a just transition is embedded within it and giving practical examples, as Thomas has said. There's very good examples from Scotland and how that can be done. It can't just be a vague term. It can't just be a buzzword. It has to actually be set for it properly. So I think that's something that definitely any piece of legislation that's set up for the North of Ireland, really does need to include that, and include it in more than just a vague way.
Declan, could I just...
I seen you nodding there, Aidan. Let's go bring you in. Go ahead,
Yeah, just to respond to Patsy's question, I mean, I suppose one of the things that people would be concerned about is oil-fired central heating and decarbonising central heating in rural communities. We're very reliant on oil, and in some homes, solid fuel. The Housing Executive are currently undertaking a pilot project up in Urbanstown where they have installed air source heat pumps and retrofitted. Now they're spending £12,000 per property on that. And they're going to measure the improvement, the thermal comfort, but also the cost over the next 4 or 5 years of that change. Now, if you said an ordinary person, meets you in the street and says, well, what's a just transition? I suppose for me, a just transition is for people who can afford to make that transition. If part of this climate change bill, I know is that, oil-fired central heating is out, or central heating has to be decarbonised in homes over the next 5-10 years, then that there is some sort of means-tested scheme for householders to do that, so that they're not, that it's fair, that, people who can afford to make those changes can go ahead and do it, but people who can't are supported. Now, and there's examples there. I mean, the Department for Communities are already funding through the council's affordable warmth scheme that's tackling fuel poverty for older and vulnerable households. That needs to be, I suppose, retooled to do that in such a way that it's decarbonised, but also that it's fair and supports a wider, I suppose, strata of people who don't have the facility to make that change. So in making those big changes that have to happen, I suppose we've got to look at who can afford to make those changes and who can't, and how we can support people. Another example to me would be, I mean, DARE has recently consulted on a peatland strategy. You know, Patsy, in terms of the Lochshore area, there's a lot of peat extraction. There could be maybe 200-300 people involved in commercial peat extraction around the Lochshore. Now, we know that has to stop in terms of carbon, but also in terms of biodiversity and supporting those ecosystems. So there's got to be some, to halt that extraction, there's got to be support then for those people to transition out of that employment and into other sustainable employment. Whether or not those people will be involved in re-wetting bogs or restoring peatland, I don't know, but there needs to be some sort of consideration given to how that transition is made away from economic activity that's actually producing carbon and degrading an ecosystem to one that's preventing that and restoring ecosystems. So for me, those would be examples in communities of how people are thinking about, what is just transition.
Hey, thank you for that, Aidan. Okay, Philip.
Thank you. Patsy and yourself, Chair, dealt with a number of, obviously I wanted to talk about accountability and just transition and targets, and those issues have been dealt with either in the initial presentations or in the questions. One issue that probably I do want to maybe ask the contributors on is the all-island nature or the transboundary issues. I know Dr. Brennan specifically pointed that out as seriously lacking in this bill. So, I just maybe like to ask the RCN, Aidan or Karen from NILGA, just in relation to that specific aspect, because I mean, obviously local councils and rural communities across the border are going to be affected with maybe different sets of scenarios or principles, or the different impacts of climate change. So just in relation to that, what's their feeling with regard to that not being an issue in this bill?
Chair, if I can maybe come in, I was talking to one of the officers from Derry City and Strabane District Council yesterday, actually, just about this kind of issue. And what she was saying was that obviously they're working very closely with Donegal County Council across the border and working on greenery infrastructure plans, on climate plans, and they have been very successful, particularly on their adaptation work and attracting money from Europe and to try to take things forward. And what she was saying is that the change now is that because the council in Donegal has a mandate to do stuff, they've got the legislation in place, they're getting do things from government, it's being funded to go forward. It's not causing difficulty, but it's very, very noticeable that there's a disparity now emerging between the councils in the south and our own councils. I mean, what our councils have done, in all 5 of our border councils have been very active in working on cross-border projects in relation to decarbonisation. We've got there's a catchment care project in Armagh, Banbridge, Craigavon, which is cross-border, and obviously a lot of our river catchment areas are cross-border, and we've got the Collaboration for Nature Network project that's going through Newry, Morningdown with border councils, and that's looking at peatland restoration. So, I mean, we have been very, very active and very innovative and I suppose proactive in the absence of the legislation, but the legislation would make things so much easier, because with legislation then that attracts funding as well, whether that be from government or to instill confidence in the private sector to invest in what's needed in Northern Ireland, because at the minute there's no direction of travel. So anybody that's looking to invest in renewable technologies or anything else is sitting asking questions about, right, okay, when's the right time to do this? There's money available. We know from the likes of work that KPMG have done that there are investors sitting out there waiting to see how they can work on this kind of thing in Northern Ireland. But without the legislation, without that direction, without the targets, it's why would you? So it's kind of, and there is a cross-border element to that, because people sort of look at this as an island if they're outside, if they're American or whatever, they want to invest, and there are elements that we can do that. I mean, one of the things as well that I would quite like to say is that with regard to government funding particularly, Ciara is right in that we are a laggard, and there is work already ongoing in GB to fund retrofitting of housing, to look at how to invest in heat pumps or whatever technology that they're looking to do. And I think what we need to make really, really sure of at the minute is that we do not miss out on the Barnett consequentials coming from that funding that should be coming across Northern Ireland and should be ring-fenced for climate action and that just transition. Because if there's money already available, we need to start looking at how to access that in Northern Ireland and put it in the right place. And without the legislation, without the targets, it's going to be very, very difficult to do. And without that, and Ciara's right in that, without that specific mention of just transition and sort of a well-articulated principles of just transition in the legislation, it's just making everything very nebulous.
Okay.
Yeah, and from our point of view, we would agree, Philip, that transboundary considerations are really important. Obviously, we're one sort of bio unit with, the points that Karen is making in terms of the environment, particularly in terms of river basins are crossing the border, peatland, stretches of peatland are crossing the border. We know that there's, agri-food, the food chains are hugely integrated across the border, so there's got to be close working between both jurisdictions in terms of any climate change legislation, any targets that are set further down in terms of the stakeholders.
Thank you. I'm not sure if Dr. Brennan or Dr. Munzer have anything that they want to add just on that specific issue.
Yes, I actually have a couple of points. I mean, I think, obviously I've talked before about, the importance of transboundary cooperation and considerations, but I think just unpicking that a bit further, on one hand, you've got the problems created when you don't have effective cooperation across the border. That's including things like when there's disparities of control, it leaves gaps for, unscrupulous people to take advantage of that. We had that with the waste regulation and transboundary, illegal transport of waste. That's not to say that similar, unintended consequences could happen or unanticipated consequences could happen if you have differentials in terms of climate regulation and air pollution. You've also got, risks associated with, pollution across the border. And we've already seen that can be a serious problem in terms of cross-border ammonia pollution, for example. And if, for example, higher standards are, put in place on one side of the border and not on the other, then that creates risks of potential legal issues associated with, the breaching of international transboundary pollution conventions, anti-pollution conventions. So I think you've got a lot of issues where you do not have proper cooperation cross-border on the island. But you've also got, I think, which is sometimes underappreciated, the benefits of proper cooperation. I think this is something that because the existing structures that are designed to deliver cooperation on environmental governance on the island, set in place in the Good Friday Agreement, they haven't really functioned to their full capacity yet, and obviously there's political issues which have prevented that in recent years with the North-South Ministerial Council. But in terms of climate, the urgency and the magnitude of the task ahead of us means that we can't afford not to have all-island cooperation on this issue. And I think that if we enshrine meaningful transboundary considerations into a really robust piece of climate legislation in Northern Ireland that really requires us to cooperate on an all-island basis, it would mean that we would be able to avail of the benefits of working together to, on either side of the border to meet the targets, and it would also detract or take away some of the problems that could be created if we don't cooperate. So I think I would just highlight that there's two sides of that, the benefits and the potential negatives if we don't have meaningful cooperation.
Okay. Okay, Philip?
Yep, thank you, Chair.
Okay. Rosemary?
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your contributions. One thing I wanted just to follow up on, and that was in relation to what Aidan said there about this project that's happening in Irvinstown. Obviously, Aidan, you're aware that's my constituency area. You talked about the housing executive putting in boilers at 12, I think it was 12,000 you said? 15,000. Now, we have at the same time in Fermanagh Omagh Council area, or it's organised by Fermanagh Omagh Council area in relation to the affordable warmth scheme. And you've individual homes. Now, if they wanted to change to this, that money is not available for them. And it makes me ask the question, does there not need to be a lot more cooperation between all of our departments here on the Assembly to try and work at this climate change together? For example, there's no point in somebody now putting in a boiler that really is not going to be carbon neutral or work towards carbon neutrality in 2050. We should be trying to maximise in relation to the grants that are being given out now at the moment.
Yeah, Rosemary, well, in terms of just that background, that housing executive project in Irvinstown is, well, they're one of the partners. It's also our Healthy Living Centre. And the £12,000 per property they have put in, it's part of an EU-wide Northern Periphery programme looking at fuel poverty and energy transition across the northern periphery of the EU. So there's partners in Scandinavian countries, partners south of the border, and partners in Scotland as well. The £12,000 was for an air source heat pump, for retrofitting insulation in those houses, for changing whatever was needed in terms of radiators. But it's a small scale project that the housing exec are looking at in terms of trying to think about the cost of and the benefits of retrofitting housing. But I would agree with you in terms of the affordable warmth project that, you're right, it makes no sense in terms of putting public money into funding affordable warmth to put in carbon intensive heating systems, or replace old inefficient oil burners with slightly more efficient oil burners that we know we're trying to phase out over the next 5 to 10 years. So I'd agree with you on that. But I guess part of it goes back to Dr. Munzer's comment earlier, in that this is a framework bill which is just setting broad ideas and principles, and until we get down into the details of, well, what's that actually going to mean in the Department for Communities, and within Department for Communities, what's that going to mean for them funding the councils who are delivering the affordable warmth scheme and making those changes. So it's almost like a cascading process that's going to take maybe 18 months, 2 years at a time that we don't have a whole lot of time to do. And I guess that's the pressure in all of this thing, in that the climate scientists have told us the 2020s are the crucial decade for making this transition, and to avoid both going over 1.5 degrees and huge environmental damage, plus even more significant costs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, I'm like Patsy. I'm living in obviously a rural community, and I have concerns about this just transition. How do we get our agricultural community to buy into this just transition? We have the CCC's advice, then we have the advice of 100% by 2045. Both those and our farming community seem to be caught in the middle, and they seem to be the scapegoats. And I would hope this would not be the case. The scapegoats in relation to the climate change bill that is going through, in the sense that people aren't happy with it. It's 82%. And I'm wondering, I listen to what you say about putting rules and regulations, bringing in regulations and laws in relation to the just process. But I'm still not convinced that you can convince your farmers of that. And I'm wondering, is there any other way that any comments you can make?
Yeah, anybody else any representative?
Kira.
Yeah, Rosie, I completely understand where you're coming from. And I think this is one of the problems. Obviously the committee's heard from, hundreds of hours probably of evidence from people, and there's a lot of buzzwords around the climate stuff, like just transition, net zero. Those concepts are very, very difficult to get your head around. I mean, even for experts, people who make it their careers to be experts in this, they're concepts that are constantly changing, as the science changes, as our analysis changes as well. They are difficult, and I think communication is therefore really key in terms of, really, and it should be led from politicians to indicate and signal to communities, all communities, because it's not just the agricultural community that's going to be affected by this. It's everybody who lives everywhere in the world needs to really be, informed about what kind of changes have to happen. And I think that the idea of a just transition, you can really boil it down to, it's an issue of fairness. And it's a fairness in terms of the fair distribution of the effort that really needs to happen in terms of meeting what has been, just an unequivocal, need to informed by science to reduce emissions. So, this framework bill sets the broad overarching, kind of concept into law of what needs to happen. The climate action plans that will be developed after that will flesh out, as we've heard before, about what that means in practice. And at that point, what we need to do is ensure that all of the decisions are being made, there's a sort of a risk assessment almost being done in terms of where is the justice and where's the fairness in each of the decisions that have to happen. I mean, you have things like, providing support for example, a well-defined nature-based solutions approach, ensuring that there's a biodiversity to ensure that any actions that are taken that, to help farmers to make that transition are done so in a way that doesn't prejudice the ability of other sectors, including people, domestic people, to make the emissions as well. I mean, the bottom line is the reduction is going to have to occur across all sectors. It should be fair in terms of which sectors, everybody's going to have to make sacrifices. So that is a sense that needs to be really communicated, that it's not that there's scapegoats in one particular sector. There are sectors that have higher emissions. And what we need to make sure is that the burden or the effort, depends, what slant you want to put on it, is equally shared across those. But that's my take on it anyway. I think communication is key. Political signalling is key. And primary legislation that is robust and includes a just transition actually protects agricultural communities and communities across the island better than vague, nebulous legislation that does not include that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, while I understand and hear what you're saying, and you talk about these reductions being equally shared, I find that a bit difficult to understand. So, in relation to then asking you, should the CC advice not be followed? The farmers or the agricultural community, the advice in the CCC advice is 82% by 2050, you understand. And if they are also making an equal contribution to the reductions, they're at the stage where it's impossible for them to reach net zero because of the extra sacrifice they will have to be made. So why is it not acceptable then to have 82%, in your opinion, by 2050? And should the CCC advice not be followed?
I think, yes, I can pass it on to my colleague Thomas. Yeah, I think he's particularly up to speed with the UK CCC and their potential role in provision of advice.
Yeah, thanks very much. Rosemary, I think there's a parcel issue has emerged relatively recently with the 82% figure. You'll recall probably from Climate Bill 1 session that EJNI was supportive of the net zero 2045 marker, but in terms of the 82% target, the CCC, as we know, calculated that as part of 5 pathways in the 6th carbon budget. And it did that on the basis really of what I would describe as a business as usual type of assumption. And it put quite heavy stress in its calculations on the fact that I think the figure is we're a significant net exporter of agri-food products, with nearly 50% of all agri-food products produced in NI consumed in the rest of the UK. And so there's one particular view in that modelling that the CCC put forward. I think I've underscored before that they're not a policy setting body. It's one factor that we need to consider. I don't think it's probably an overriding determinative factor. But since then, of course, we've seen that the UK has entered into a fairly substantial free trade agreement with Australia, which is going to have significant impacts on the agri market here in the UK, it seems. Also, an agreement has been made in principle now with New Zealand, hasn't it, which is also projected to have likely very significant impacts. And while it was just a research paper rather than government policy, we also saw relatively recently that there was there's quite a substantial leak of a blueprint designed to change public behaviour to cut carbon emissions that included levies on high carbon food, and that was published, as we'll have seen, alongside the government's net zero strategy, and then it was quickly withdrawn. Now, I underscore that was a research paper. It was not government policy, but the content, which is leaning on tax really that would radically affect our export market in principle to GB, would be presumably concerning if it was followed through in terms of the status quo that the 82% figures modelled on. So what I'm kind of underscoring here is that the 82% figure was calculated on what I've described as a business as usual model. Things have shifted now. I think personally, if I were a minister, I would probably seek to request the CCC recalculate based on some of the changes and shifts we've seen. By that, obviously, EJNI, we've given reasons as to why we support our lean towards the net zero 2045. But I think that 82% figure, since there's been a shift in business as usual as well, might be potentially subject to some concerns and queries.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Claire, you're next. Claire? We lost Claire, have we?
We have not, thanks.
We got you.
Great. I think it's just been really, really interesting. And maybe just sort of two sort of avenues of questions to come in on. And I think just following on from what you said there, Thomas. So obviously this bill number 2 has set the 82% as a target by 2050. And we're hearing along with that 82% target is based on the science. So I'd like your thoughts maybe on that one, just following from what you were already discussing. Do you think that 82% is a scientific target? And yeah, I think you would cover most of it there again. You know, how would Northern Ireland setting 82% in primary legislation impact us across the island? So if the UK is trying to get to net zero by 2050 or faster, if we're going to speed or accelerate that up, we're sitting at 82%. Then you've got the transboundary all island, you know, the Republic of Ireland then going for net zero. You know, talk us through what you see as any predictive or things that we need to be considering about the impact on that. And then maybe for Karen and Aidan, what kind of roles do you feel that councils should be given? We're seeing that the Minister has released his green growth strategy. I know that was done one evening during recess, but if you've had a chance to look at that, you know, that's where we're looking at, you know, the principles of just transition or the climate action plans, for example. Do you feel then that a strategy to roll that out is the best place, or do we need to look at embedding that within primary legislation in order to maybe maximise the potential for adaptation measures? And it's good to hear, you know, the executive role like the heat pumps and that sort of adaptation and transition. But, you know, is it fair enough to leave that within a strategy, or would you like to see that, or would it help you guys better if it was in primary legislation?
Shall I start, since the first question is direct to me? Thank you very much, Claire. Thanks for the interesting questions. I think they really sort of point to drawing out insightful issues. So the 82% target you mentioned first, is that predicated on the science? Well, one might answer yes, but I think it's probably an incorrect answer. The yes would be that we're going as a whole in the UK for net zero for 2050 under the Climate Change Act 2008, Section 1, and that covers us scientifically, if you will. My sense is we could probably go even further than that, but aggregated within that then is the Northern Irish performance at 82%. But that performance at 82% is only considered scientific on the basis that it's aggregated within the broader 2050 net zero target. The fundamental point is scientifically we need to be aiming for that net zero 2050 target or sooner if we want to be in keeping with the science. So the idea that we're just aggregated into this broader figure doesn't suggest to me that on a jurisdictional basis we are actually in keeping with the scientific demands of the problem to hit that for 2050 or indeed sooner. 2045 net zero would be an improvement on that. To just point then to the CCC's calculations, I think it's probably fair to say, I'm not a scientist or an environmental economist, that the CCC sketched out 5 pathways. Presumably it modelled the outcomes correctly, but one thing it didn't do is sketch out further pathways. The CCC point out in the 6th carbon budget that there's no technical reason why NI can't reach net zero. So if I was king for a day, I'd like to say, well, could you model that path to see what it looks like? So that's an important path of modelling. What I also underscored to Ms. Barton was that if we, follow, well, you do more than follow politics, you folks are steeped in it, but politics and the news and outputs and so on, the business as usual type of calculation, as I would put it, that the CCC predicated the agricultural aspects of its calculations and assumptions on have arguably moved. I think there's a strong argument. I've mentioned a couple of free trade agreements we've seen. Okay, there was only one particular leak that was a report, not policy, but there's a psychology around potentially taxing agri-foods in GB and so forth, which underscores potential vulnerabilities of relying on the market as we've currently underscored it. And it's worth pointing out, I have the Observer, 24th of the 10th, 21 in front of me. There's coverage in that on page 19, which I can provide to the committee, or you may have seen, that sketch out Lord Debon's response to those trade agreements, and he is very scathing of those. I appreciate he's appeared before the committee on Bill 2, but it would be quite interesting to draw out his scathing criticism of those comments because of their specific impact on agri and our internal market. So there's certainly a conversation to be had there as well. I think just secondly, your question about what happens if we nail our colours to the mast in terms of the 82% target when we're seeing the Republic of Ireland striving for net zero, at least for 2050. We know an EU climate law came in recently that sketches out a net zero 2050 obligation for the EU. We've already touched on the UK Climate Change Act 2050 net zero target under section 1.1. I think what would likely happen is we would start to fall behind, to put it slightly crudely, in a number of important areas, and perhaps just even generally economically. How are we going to draw substantial levels of renewable subsidies into our economy? Let's say if we have a less stringent legislative driver there, are our roads infrastructure and so forth going to keep up with electric charge points that are going to be populating increasingly Republic of Ireland roads? Maybe an HGV wants to come across the border, do business here, and this is happening all the time, and travel and do trade. Perhaps our infrastructure hasn't kept up. Where do we stand with R&D? Is investment going to go elsewhere? And so on and so forth. So I think there's a general principle that if we don't keep up with the green economy in relation to our neighbours, there will be likely substantial negative economic impact. And that's before one comes to the moral case as well. Of course, we want to be doing our bit morally to redress this problem. And there would be adaptation issues as well that we could talk about in addition to mitigation. So that's my sense on the two questions you posed there, Claire, and thank you very much for those.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, Thomas. Very helpful. Okay, members, I have...
Chair, I think maybe Claire had asked me about the role of councils as well. Sorry. No, it was really just, Claire, just to note, obviously the role of councils in Northern Ireland is very different from the role of councils across the water. They obviously have a lot of social housing and responsibility for roads and transport and public transport in some areas, and that means that I suppose the role for councils in Northern Ireland is a lot more defined and a lot smaller. But we have been working very closely with our colleagues across the water and looking at how to enshrine the role of councils and the role of local government in the climate action plans, and also making sure that we have sufficient and appropriate resources and funding to do what we need to do and deliver on what we need to deliver on. I mean, without retrofitting, without social care, without transport in Northern Ireland, the main things that we have influence over is the most important thing is probably the planning function, and making sure that we have an intelligent, climate-informed planning policy and local development plans going forward, so that we maybe don't have the same objections to the technologies and the developments that we need to decarbonise as a region, and that's a conversation that is going to really ramp up over the next while. Obviously, we've got a big responsibility for waste management, and I was sort of listening in on your conversation earlier on about anaerobic digesters, but there's a need for a really intelligent conversation about how we decarbonise our waste management operations, and I mean, we have been successful in relation to dealing with food waste and diverting that from landfill, but we need to go much further. We've obviously an involvement in procurement and sort of influencing that, and that sort of community leadership work that we need to do to broker those conversations, to bring the community forward and to build that understanding that is coming across from yourselves, that maybe in some areas it's not there. And I mean, I agree. I think people are sort of have got this fear hanging over them now, and we need to make sure that people are aware of what they're doing. I mean, we in NILGA are working with the Department for Business but it's the Department for Bayes, I'm not going to outline the full name, but they have provided funding for regional roadshow events as part of COP, and one of those things is actually we've helped fund is a 2-week-long conference in Belfast, or 2-week-long festival, to start those community conversations, business conversations about how to go forward, and particularly I suppose that there's a circular economy theme to that work, but it's that civic leadership role that's going to be really, really important for us, as well as I suppose we've got city and growth deals that need to be very aware of the sort of decarbonisation agenda. I mean, Claire, you had asked about the green growth strategy. I have been working with the department on the development of that draft strategy, and I'm very pleased that they have acknowledged the role of councils as far as it goes here in Northern Ireland, and they have acknowledged that we've been getting on with things and being very active. Most of that has been because we have had mention in UK legislation about adaptation. And so we have been able to get on with adaptation. We've been able to attract funding for adaptation work. And it's the gap has been on the mitigation side. So what we're really looking forward to from this legislation is getting that definition on how we need to go forward on mitigation. So that's kind of what we're hoping to get out of whatever legislation ends up coming through the Assembly, and hopefully it'll come through soon.
Perfect. Okay.
And Claire, I think, Claire, your point to me, if I picked it up right, was whether or not green growth is it better as a strategy or legislation. Is that the question? Because you were cutting out a wee bit. Well, I mean, from our point of view, I confess I hold my hand up. I haven't had a chance yet to go through the green growth strategy. But I suppose from a community point of view, for individual people in rural communities perspective, whether it's legislation or strategy, I mean, I think there's a job of work to be done in terms of that. You know, I think it might have been Dr. Brennan mentioned it earlier, that idea of carbon literacy and building people's knowledge and skills to make the choices, you know, on a household level and on I suppose, on an individual business level, to get an idea of, you know, what are the choices to be making now to future-proof in terms of reducing carbon. But I think there's also something, maybe a broader piece of work that might be done along the lines of the Climate Assembly that was held in Britain, which reported, I think it might have been last year or the year before, with these lockdowns, have kind of run it out of when things were happening. But I mean, it did really interesting work in terms of taking a cross section of people across Britain and drilling down into the details of what was fair in terms of changes to people's lifestyle, in terms of travel, in terms of heating, in terms of, you know, even the types of food they're eating, you know, and what were the dilemmas around that. But I think that sort of granular detail of the choices that people are going to have to make, I think, you know, that's going to have to be done and thought about in real detail if we're going to bring communities and people along with us.
Chair, sorry to interrupt. I have to apologise for Councillor Burgess got cut off and has been unable to come back in again. But I'm conscious that I've had several conversations with Councillor Burgess about. I mean, he's obviously from a farming background, and in relation to Miss Barton's comments about sort of the difficulties for farmers. I mean, his take on this is that what they're looking for is clarity. They need to know what they have to achieve, and I suppose with the policies that they are working with from previous department and sort of that have been ongoing for a long time on the Going for Growth strategy and so forth, there's a need for a lead-in time for change. So that clarity is something that they need fairly soon. And I mean, with the Green Growth strategy, what really concerned me in my first look at it was the fact that they aren't setting sectoral targets in that strategy. So if the sectoral targets aren't in the legislation and they're not in the Green Growth strategy, then we're then waiting again for clarity from something else. And I mean, I imagine that the department have a plan on how they're going to do all this, but it's just not transparent to the sectors that need the information at the moment.
That's great. Okay then. So, Karen, Dr. Brennan, Dr. Windsor, and obviously Councillor Burgess, Karen, can pass on our thanks as well. And Aidan, I want to thank you very much for joining us this morning. As always, very, very detailed responses to our questions and very insightful. And we very much appreciate your insight and expertise and all this here. So, okay, folks, I'll wish you, we're into the afternoon now, so I wish you, hope you have a good day, and we'll, no doubt we will be in touch as we continue along this process. So thank you very much. Okay, folks?
Thank you.
Take care now. See you all again now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you now. Okay, members, we're moving on to number 13, this correspondence, page 196. I want to draw attention to page 203 of your packs, and it's an invitation from my park to do a visit to understand what the industry is doing to help reduce its emissions. Our members agreed we should write to my park, accept an invitation, and to scope out a date in the new year at some stage for a visit. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Page 225 of your packs. Correspondence from the department outline that they will bring forward an amendment at consideration stage of the horse racing amendment bill at the committee's request to facilitate fund payments to cover costs incurred by racecourse operators following the end of the EU exit period, which is 31st of December 2020. Any payments before this time would be a breach of EU subsidy rules. A further minor amendment will also be made. Okay. Members, I'd like to also draw your attention to page 213 of your packs. The letter from the department advising the executive has supported the minister's proposal to bring forward the Service Animals Welfare Bill, otherwise known as Finn's Law, with a request for accelerated passage. It is expected to be introduced on the 15th of November. We'll draw members' attention to page 230 from the minister, who has requested the committee seek to complete scrutiny of the climate change number 2 bill as soon as possible, and ideally before the deadline of the 20th of January, so that the Assembly has adequate time to consider it before the end of the mandate. The letter also indicates that negotiations have been taking place between DARE officials, the sponsors of the number 1 bill, to scope a potential compromise on both bills, and these are unlikely to continue. Can I ask members for their thoughts on this, and if they are content that we reply to the Minister noting his request, and that the committee will endeavour to complete a scrutiny in a timely manner, but we must be allowed adequate time to complete effective scrutiny. Okay? Okay, members, I'd like to draw your attention then to a letter from the Department at page 378 of the packs, following the Minister's briefing on the 14th of October on the Green Growth Strategy and its intention to bid for 600 million of investment. The Department has indicated that they're indicative estimates only, covering a range of projects, but has not yet had any details. I want to ask members if you're okay for us to write to the Department seeking clarification on the specific projects the funding is being sought for and the requisite allocations, and to confirm when the bids are submitted to the Department for Finance. Okay. Okay, members, page 392, there's correspondence from the NI Sheep Scab Control and Eradication Group. We have contacted the committee to seek the opportunity to provide a briefing on the issue and how it can be controlled. Are we okay to receive a briefing on this issue from the... Yeah, okay, thank you. Members, okay, we accent the rest of the correspondence as suggested in the index page 196. Okay. The draft forward programme N14 is page 397 here, packs. Can I seek agreement for the forward work programme? Okay. Members, I also am advised that a spotlight programme aired last Thursday raised a number of potential environmental concerns and issues falling on the remit of the NI Environment Agency. Can I ask if members are content that we seek an update from the department? Okay. Okay. I also like to remind members of the event that's taking place next Wednesday at 10 a.m. at Sustrans NI, where we will have a presentation on their active travel programme, followed by an opportunity to trial e-bikes on the estate. Patsy, I just see you down there for a question.
Yeah, Chair. I too had raised this with Nick just about the Spotlight programme, and I'm sure all of us watched that with those of us that are either bordering on it or indeed like yourself representing it. So it did raise some issues around NIEA, and I think it would be appropriate Yes, I hear what you're saying to write to the department about it, but I think it would be appropriate that we hear from NIEA as to their reflections on the issues that were raised in the Spotlight programme. Many of us have concerns about gold mining at all, and indeed would resist the notion of it, but we'd want to make sure that those government agencies that are within the remit of this committee are carrying out their role effectively and properly in light of the concerns that there are in the area.
Yep. I agree with you, Patsy. We will want to hear directly from NIEA.
Yes, please, Chair.
As well as the department, maybe perhaps both of them, Patsy, because they're connected there. Okay. We're at any other business, and I see Philip has indicated on the WhatsApp group he wants to raise something on any other business, or anybody else they can factor it in there too. Philip?
Chair, I'm hoping this is the appropriate point to raise it. I just wanted to thank the Assembly and the committee for providing, I know you were at it as well, a number of tickets for COP26. Me and yourself were there on Monday. I have to say it was a really invigorating experience in terms of being there and engaging with communities and individuals and organisations from right across the world and listening to their particular issues that they're dealing with, whether it's the impacts of climate change or issues and legislation similar to ourselves in terms to try and adapt to those implications or legislate to ensure that they don't happen. So, I mean, we were there. We certainly engaged as best we could on that particular day. We met a number of organisations locally and, as I say, from across the world. And I just wanted to put on record thanks to the Assembly and the committee for allowing us the opportunity to go and be there and experience COP26. Obviously, the main purpose, I mean, we are not going to have a huge impact on the outcome. I mean, that's at a scale much beyond this committee, but our fingers should be crossed that world leaders do take heed to the growing concern and that action comes out of COP26.
Thank you, Philip. Rosemary?
Okay, thank you. Look, I want to raise something that's been brought to my attention. Just one. I'll send the details in to Nick later, and perhaps we could get an answer. It's in relation to the organic egg sector at the moment. So the UK has a derogation which expires at the end of the year for a move to have 100% organic feed, which is currently at 95% organic feed. And there's a problem with feed mills trying to source this. So I'm wondering, is it possible to raise that through the committee? And I will give further details to Nick on that.
Yeah, I think that would be okay. I'm sure members are content with that. Claire?
Thanks, Chair. I just want to say, just on the back of what Philip was saying there as well, I'm heading over to COP right now, just with the Assembly ticket. So I'm heading for the book now and I'm going to be leaving. So it won't be about for the session on Climate Bill number 1. But obviously then, if anybody has any questions, queries, if the committee wants me to respond to anything in terms of the bill, I'll do it as soon as I come back. I'll be back on Tuesday. Okay?
Yeah.
Just to say thanks. I'm looking forward to COP.
If you haven't let we can maybe the school's right now, but your Claire, we will certainly reflect that you're in transition whenever the event on this afternoon, and should also mention Philip. That was a mighty task you done as well. A good advertisement for active travel. But
thank you to everybody. I'm going to head on now. Okay, thanks.
Safe travels, Claire. Okay, take care now. Okay, members. Before we move into the closed session, the next meeting will take place on Thursday at 10 a.m. and it'll be a hybrid meeting streamed on the Assembly website. So take care, folks, and we're going to move into a closed session here now. Okay.
Committee room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30.